And I'll start off with the feminist insight that the body really is an outcome of what happens to the body, is an outcome of relations of social power. So even though we've placed HIV/AIDS in the domain of public health, it is really an outcome of social power, particularly class and gender inequalities. And there's a whole body of literature that recognizes that. But when we come to our public or our policy discourse and policy interventions, it does not center policy interventions, because dealing with HIV and AIDS means dealing with this whole structural dimension of inequality and poverty. And so there is no wonder that we don't address it, even though we have to place it, that HIV/AIDS is as much social and historical as it is biomedical. We have this, and the effects of the global crisis will probably be that it will intensify those those structural drivers that have brought us to the level of endemic levels within Southern Africa. The next point is the question of our reliance on donor funding with regard to HIV treatment, and the power differentials that creates, the whole power-knowledge nexus in terms of donors controlling the policy discourse and deciding the parameters of the debate, and also what is the donor agenda. You spoke earlier about the question of the militarization and AFCON, and there is the fear that HIV/AIDS with a PEPFAR funding will be used to actually propagate and use as leverage to actually gain that agenda of getting a military base in Southern Africa, particularly since we have the African command coming from Germany, and that this funding is ultimately going to be used to actually get these foreign policy and strategic objectives of the role for the US and everyone else. But my biggest problem has been that there has been a confluence. If you look at the historical trajectory of capitalism and patriarchy in Southern Africa, there is a convergence, a link between pre-capitalist forms of exploitation and capitalist forms of exploitation. And central to that is African patriarchy. And there is a tendency amongst the academics and Pan-Africanists to ignore that patriarchy, because there's a reassertion of African identities in view of the colonial history and racist past, that African identity and African culture, whatever was African, was denigrated. And now there's a reinvention of African identity, and there's a refusal to discuss African patriarchy as central to African culture and African identity. And so there's always the question of polygamy and initiation rites, bride wealth, widow cleansing, wife inheritance, surrogate marriage, and its role in the spreading of HIV and AIDS that gets ignored. And with the donors coming in, they've created a new discourse and a new language. They've actually decontaminated it from its past. Where we're talking now, the language we're using is multiple and concurrent partnership. We don't talk about polygamy, so that we don't have to confront African patriarchy, and we don't have to confront Jacob Zuma about these polygamous relationships and the role that polygamy plays and bride wealth plays in the control over the female body, over female sexuality, and over female labor and fertility. And so there's a reluctance to confront it as part of this post-colonial discourse in academia. Liberal or African academia. Liberal academics say we can't criticize Africans because that would seem or appear to be racist. And so there's a challenge to African academia to actually interrogate African forms of oppression and exploitation, including the role of female labor in pre-capitalist and capitalist forms of accumulation. The other question that I wanted to raise is the question or the fiction, which Edward Said calls the fiction of neutrality, and the role of the United Nations and all these agencies that control AIDS discourse, AIDS funding, AIDS policy making, and at the same time not place it in its historical and social context, and accepting at the same time the logic of the market in terms of ARV supplies. We see that the global financial crisis will probably intensify the structural dimensions of HIV. It will exacerbate the structural dimensions of HIV/AIDS, increase poverty and inequality. At the same time, donor funds will most likely dry up, and programs, because of corporate bailouts, and the implications are that we would scale down our health programs. But at the moment, let me just look at the statistics. We have American funding accounting for around 40% or 50% of health funding in most of the Southern African countries. In Namibia, for example, our AIDS budget, 11% of our AIDS budget comes from national sources or domestic sources. Most of it comes from donor funding. And what would be the implication of this philanthropic model in view of the fact that there will be donor withdrawal? We probably have less funds for prevention programs, less funds for voluntary testing programs, less funds for research, but more importantly, less funds for universal treatment access. And what would that mean? We have 3 million people currently in Sub-Saharan Africa on treatment, and the World Bank expects that 70% of people on ARVs will, as a result of the global crisis, actually experience negative impacts. That means disruptions in ARV supplies, and these disruptions will mean increased levels of morbidity that will place pressure on our ailing health systems. We will have spread of drug-resistant strains of the virus, and we'd have increased levels of mortality. And all this will mean loss of labor supply, income loss, food insecurity, decreased levels of food production, rising orphan populations, and a reproduction of reproduction and intensification of inequalities that in turn would actually increase risk behavior. But the question that we are posing is the whole model for ARV provision and the commodification of that. We've accepted blindly, we've accepted the market, the logic of the market for ARV production, the commodification thereof, and there is no question that we seek alternative production and delivery mechanisms of ARV drugs. And the philanthropic discourse that now dominates and the framework through which ARVs are provided actually prevent us from interrogating the logic of the market and the present ARV supply, present formats of ARV supply. The question also is, we have additional issues. The economic crisis may likely lead to social unrest, and we've seen that in Kenya post-election unrest and in Zimbabwe, social unrest will cause disruptions in ARV supply, of course leading to questions of the spreading of drug-resistant strains of ARVs. There's a question of climate change, floodings and so on leading to disruptions in ARV supply. There's also the question of food supply and food security affecting treatment adherence. You cannot take the drugs if you haven't eaten. You cannot actually take the drugs. We're looking at the question of the commodification generally of services like water privatization when people cannot cook. ARV, people suffering from AIDS and taking the drugs cannot cook their food in order to take the drugs, and so on, and poverty that increases risky sexual behavior. So the whole question of accepting the dominant and hegemonic discourses around AIDS and the policy interventions around AIDS prevents us from looking for alternatives in terms of whether or not we center the structural drivers around policy making, whether we look at the questions of inequality and poverty, and whether we accept the market mechanisms and commodification of service delivery.